If you stood outdoor the huge stone fort of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street in London on the morning of September 15, 1992, you'll have seen an image of absolute permanence. For 300 years, the old lady of Threadneedle Street had stood because of the father or mother of the British economic system. It became the rock upon which the British Empire were built. It had financed wars towards Napoleon and Hitler. It had managed the Forex that dominated a quarter of the globe. The pound sterling became extra than simply cash. It turned into a countrywide identity. It became an image of British balance and British delight. But inside the thick stone walls on that grey September morning, panic becomes starting to set in. The men inside the pinstripe fits who ran the financial institution knew a secret that the vacationers outdoor did not. They knew that the bank changed into underneath attack. They have been now not being attacked by means of an army or a navy. They had been not being bombed through the Luftwaffe. They had been being attacked with the aid of a force that changed into invisible, silent, and infinitely greater effective than any army. They were being attacked by the financial markets. Specifically, they were being hunted through a person named George Soros. George Soros changed into not a popular or a baby kisser. He became a 62i vintage hedge fund manager sitting in a workplace in a skyscraper in Manhattan, 3,000 miles away. He did not command tanks. He commanded cash. And in this specific week in 1992, he had decided that the British Empire changed into bluffing. He had decided that the rate of the British pound became a lie. And he became inclined to wager $10 billion that he ought to prove it. This is the tale of Black Wednesday. It is the story of the finest monetary raid in records. It is the story of how a single dealer added the United Kingdom to its knees and pressured it to give up its financial sovereignty. It is the story of the day the 19th century collided with the 20th century and the 20th century won. To understand why a hedge fund supervisor thought he should cost a fortune of England, we have to pass back to the political panorama of Europe inside the overdue 80s. The Cold War turned into ending. The Berlin Wall had fallen. There turned into a feeling of tremendous optimism within the air. The nations of Europe, which had spent centuries combating every other, decided that the only manner to save you some other battle changed into to bind their economies collectively so tightly that they might by no means be pulled aside. They created a system referred to as the trade charge mechanism, or the ERM. The purpose of the ERM changed into to create the area of monetary balance in Europe. It became a prelude to the euro, the unmarried currency that exists these days. The idea became easy. All the currencies of Europe might be tied collectively. The French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish beta, and the British pound would all be pegged to every other. They could move up and down together, like a flotilla of ships tied to an unmarried anchor. And that anchor was the German mark. Germany changed into the financial powerhouse of Europe. Its central financial institution, the Bundesbank, changed into mythical for its field. The Germans hated inflation. They were scarred by means of the hyperinflation of the 20s while people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. So the Bundesbank always stored the German mark sturdy and solid. The other nations of Europe wanted to import that stability. They wanted to borrow Germany's credibility. Britain joined the ERM in October 1990 underneath Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Though she turned into reluctant, her successor, John Major, became a true believer. He believed that pegging the pound to the German mark could tame the high inflation that had plagued Britain for many years. The British government set the rate at 2.95 German marks to 1 British pound. They promised the arena that they would shield this rate at all fees. They stated the pound could in no way drop beneath 2.77 marks. It was a line inside the sand. But there has been a problem with the ERM, a deadly flaw that George Soros would ultimately exploit. The gadget assumed that each one of the international locations in Europe would have the identical monetary desires on the identical time. It assumed that what became right for Germany might additionally be top for Britain. In 1992, that assumption fell aside. While the rest of Europe changed into celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany was paying the invoice. The reunification of West and East Germany became notably luxurious. The German government had to spend billions to rebuild the crumbling infrastructure of the East. To prevent this spending from inflicting inflation, the German relevant financial institution did what it continually did. It raised interest fees. High interest quotes are like a ruin on an economy. They cool matters down. For Germany in 1992, excessive hobby quotes made perfect experience. But for Britain, excessive interest costs had been a catastrophe. Britain became now not booming like Germany. Britain became in a deep recession. People have been losing their jobs. Homeowners have been suffering to pay their mortgages. Businesses have been going bankrupt. When an economy is in a recession, the principal bank commonly cuts hobby fees to make borrowing less expensive and stimulate boom. Britain needed low hobby costs desperately, but due to the fact Britain changed into locked within the ERM, it couldn't cut prices. If Britain reduced costs, investors might promote the pound and purchase the mark to get the better returns in Germany. The price of the pound could fall, and beneath the guidelines of the ERM, the pound turned into now not allowed to fall. So Britain was trapped in a golden cage, to live within the European club. British authorities had to keep interest rates painfully high, forcing its very own people to suffer to keep a currency trading charge that turned into totally artificial. The British financial system changed into screaming for comfort. However, the politicians had tied their very own hands. Enter George Soros. Soros became a student of philosophy earlier than he was a scholar of finance. He had survived the Nazi occupation of Hungary as a boy, and had found out early on that authority figures often lie, and that systems are regularly fragile. He developed a principle called reflexivity. In simple terms, reflexivity meant that markets aren't efficient. Markets are made of human beings and people make errors. Sometimes the markets consider a tale that is fake. And when the distance between the tale and the truth receives too massive, everything collapses. In the summertime of 1992, Soros checked out the British pound, and he noticed a massive gap among reality and the story. The tale, informed by means of John Major within the Bank of England, was that the pound became strong and well worth nearly 3 German marks. The fact turned into that the British economic system became collapsing, and the only factor preserving the pound up changed into high interest fees that have been destroying the United States of America. Soros sat in his office at Quantum Fund together with his lead analyst Stanley Denmiller. Denmiller was a genius at analyzing macroeconomic traits. He instructed Soros that the situation turned into unsustainable. He said that Britain turned into like a man preserving his breath underwater. He can do it for a while. However, eventually he has to return up for air. Eventually Britain might have to lower hobby fees, and once they did, the pound might crash. The beauty of the exchange became that it was a one-way wager. If Soros wagered against the pound and he turned into incorrect, the worst that would happen became that the British authorities could hold the pound solid, and he would lose a tiny sum of money on transaction costs. But if he turned into proper and the pound crashed, he could make a fortune. It was a gamble with nearly no threat and infinite reward. But Soros became not the only one looking. The entire international economic market turned into starting to odor blood. Hedge finances, banks, and currency traders all over the world were searching at the ERM and seeing the cracks. The Italian LRA became the primary to wobble. In early September, the LRA got here beneath assault. The Italian principal bank spent billions seeking to protect it, however failed. The LRA turned into devalued. This was the signal Soros have been expecting. If Italy should fall, Britain ought to fall. The trigger came on Tuesday, September 15th. The president of the German Bundesbank, Helmut Schlesinger, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal in a German newspaper. Schlesinger was a strict disciplinarian. He became tired of helping vulnerable currencies like the pound and the lira. In the interview, he changed into cautious, however he dropped a touch. He counseled that for the ERM to survive, a few currencies would possibly need to be realigned. He didn't say the word pound, but absolutely everyone knew what he supposed. He became effectively announcing that the German vital financial institution could no longer combat to shop the British pound. He was giving the markets permission to attack. When the document of this interview hit the newswires in New York, it changed into like a starter pistol going off. Stanley Druckenmiller walked into George Soros' office. He said that Schlesinger's comments were the catalyst. He proposed that they must increase their guess towards the pound. At the time, they had a position of approximately 1.5 billion. Derek Miller advised constructing it up to maybe 3 or 4 billion. Soros checked out him and uttered one of the most famous lines in financial history. He stated, "If you're proper, then you definitely cannot be just a little bit proper. You need to cross for the jugular." Soros advised him to bet the entirety. He informed him to leverage the whole fund. He instructed him to promote 10 billion well worth of sterling. That night time, the Quantum Fund went to battle. They began calling banks everywhere in the international. They borrowed British pounds from all of us who might lend them. They borrowed from British banks, American banks, and Japanese banks. Then they immediately bought the one's pounds for German marks. The mechanics of a short sale are critical to understand here. Soros changed into borrowing something he didn't very own, promoting it at the contemporary high fee, waiting for the price to crash, and then making plans to buy it lower back inexpensive later to go back it to the lender. The difference might be his income. By the time the solar commenced to upward push over London, at the morning of Wednesday, September 16th, Soros and the rest of the market had built up a massive identify wave of promote orders. They had been selling pounds faster then absolutely everyone may want a count number. Inside the British Treasury, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, became woken by a phone call. The news turned into terrible. The pound turned into already slipping in the Asian markets, which had opened hours earlier. The selling changed into relentless. Lamont became the person accountable for the British economic system. He became a smart guy, however, he turned into, in a not possible function. He drove to the Treasury building in Whitehall. The ecosystem was grim. The officials knew that this present day will be the last take a look at. They had a war chest of overseas Forex reserves, approximately $40 billion worth. Their plan changed into to apply this money to shop for up the kilos that Soros and the others were promoting. They hoped that by means of shopping for their own foreign money, they might maintain the charge up. It became a strategy that had labored earlier then. Central banks are effective. They can usually bully the marketplace into submission, but they by no means confronted a market this massive or this competitive. At 8:30 inside the morning, the London markets opened. The Bank of England, without delay, intervened. The investors on the bank commenced shopping for kilos in chunks of loads of hundreds of thousands. They shouted purchase orders down the phone traces, trying to show electricity. Usually, while the Bank of England steps in, the market pauses. Traders get scared. They don't want to combat the government. But in this morning, the marketplace didn't pause. It did not even blink. For each million kilos, the Bank of England sold the hedge budget, bought 2 million. Soros became promoting. Other hedge budget had been selling. Major agencies like Ford and BP, seeing the pound falling, commenced selling their own cash reserves to protect themselves. It turned into a stampede. The Bank of England was burning via its reserves at a terrifying price. Imagine status on a beach looking to keep back the tide with a bucket. That is what the financial institution changed into doing. They were spending the British taxpayers' cash, billions of pounds of it, essentially handing it over to George Soros. By 10 inside the morning, it turned into clean that intervention wasn't operating. The pound became pinned to the ground of the ERM trading band. It changed into soaring just above 277 marks. If it fell below that, Britain would be in violation of the treaty. Norman Lamont and the financial institution officials held a crisis assembly. They realized they needed to boost. They needed to use their largest weapon, hobby quotes. If buying the foreign money did in paintings, they needed to make the foreign money greater precious to preserve. They needed to enhance interest charges so excessive that speculators would be tempted to shop for pounds to earn the hobby. At 10:30 inside the morning, the Bank of England introduced a shock interest rate hike. They raised the base rate from 10% to 12%. A 2% hike in a single day is almost exceptional. In normal instances, it might motive the foreign money to soar. Lamont was hoping this would be the knockout blow that would ship Soros strolling for cover. But the market didn't soar. The market laughed. The traders checked out the charge hike and they did not see energy. They noticed desperation. They noticed a government that became panicking. They knew that the British economic system became already susceptible. They knew that house owners had been already screaming about 10% mortgage charges. They knew that elevating fees to 12% might cause a political revolution. They knew the authorities couldn't sustain it for a number of days. So instead of buying pounds, the market offered even more. They noticed the fee hike as the ultimate gasp of a loss-of-life animal. The price of the pound barely moved. It stayed stuck at the lowest. George Soros in New York noticed the rate hike and smiled. He knew he had gained. When a government does something that crazy and the marketplace ignores it, the sport is over. He informed Duck and Miller to keep selling. Inside Downing Street, Prime Minister John Major became watching his career crumble. He was the man who had staked his recognition at the ERM. He had promised the US of A that the pound would be sturdy. Now he changed into watching the wealth of the country flow out of the door into the wallet of speculators. The smartphone lines between Downing Street, the Treasury, and the Bank of England were pink hot. They have been strolling out of alternatives. They were jogging out of cash. They had spent billions in a few hours. At this point, the British government started out to resemble a crew on a sinking deliver, throwing the fixtures overboard to stay afloat. They considered suspending buying and selling. They considered fining the banks. But they knew that would best damage London's reputation as an economic center. They had one card left to play, the nuclear choice. They determined to elevate interest prices again. At 2:15 within the afternoon of the identical day, the Bank of England introduced a second charge hike. They raised the rate from 12% to 15%. 15%. It turned into a variety of that struck terror into the coronary heart of every person in Britain with a mortgage or a mortgage. If that price caught, it implied bankruptcy for thousands and thousands. It turned into financial suicide. It became a bluff so big that the authorities hoped the market might just blink out of sheer shock. But the market became relentless. The buyers knew it became a bluff. They knew John Major couldn't hold charges at 15% without his very own birthday celebration throwing him out of office. The sell orders saved coming. The pound kept falling. The recreation changed into up. The Bank of England had spent billions. They had raised rates to insane tiers. And the pound became nevertheless crashing. The would possibly of the British Empire had been pitted against the logic of the unfastened marketplace, and the marketplace had gained. As the afternoon wore on, the exhausted officials in the Treasury positioned down their phones. There turned into nothing left to do. They couldn't buy any greater pounds. They could not enhance fees any higher. They needed to give up. The decision was made at the Assembly in Admiral Tea House. John Major Norman Lamont and the senior ministers gathered in a somber temper. They agreed to droop Britain's membership inside the ERM. They would allow the pound flow, which supposed they might allow it crash. At 7:30 inside the night, Norman Lamont walked out of the Treasury to face a battery of cameras. He looked faded and shaken. He examined a quick declaration announcing that Britain changed into retreating from the change charge mechanism and that the interest rate hikes were cancelled. It became a complete humiliation. In New York, George Soros and his group stopped buying and selling. They had started the day with a massive brief position. As the pound crashed inside the days that followed, they sold lower back the kilos they owed at a miles lower fee. The difference changed into their profit. When the dust settled, George Soros had made over $1 billion in a married day. He had single-handedly broken the Bank of England. But the story of Black Wednesday is not pretty much the money. It is about the shift in energy. It became the moment the world found out that governments not controlled the monetary machine. The digital herd of traders controlled it. This is the end of part one. In Element, we are able to go inside the buying and selling rooms to peer the minute-by-minute chaos of that day. We will explore the political fallout that destroyed the Conservative Party's recognition for a generation. And we can take a look at the abnormal irony that Black Wednesday would possibly have simply been the high-quality thing that ever happened to the British economy. We will see how this catastrophe stored Britain out of the euro and set the level for the present-day monetary global. The warfare became over. However, the battle for the destiny of Europe had simply all started. The solar set on London on the night time of September 16, 1992, but nobody within the monetary district went domestic. The town became buzzing with a chaotic strength that felt greater, just like the aftermath of a revolution, than a commercial enterprise day. In the pubs and wine bars of the town of London, investors have been celebrating. They had been young men in suspenders and blouse sleeves, loud and adrenaline-fueled, consuming champagne. They had just made fortunes. They had bet in opposition to their personal country's foreign money, and they had won. But throughout Metropolis, within the somber places of work of Whitehall, the temper became furial. The British authorities have been humiliated on the sector level. The Bank of England, the symbol of imperial balance, had been broken open and looted by using a gang of speculators led by means of a Hungarian logician in New York. To understand the sheer scale of the devastation, we must have a look at the numbers. In their determined try to store the pound, the Bank of England had spent over 3 billion kilos of taxpayer cash. That is not 33 billion kilos of currency exchange. That is 3 billion pounds of pure loss. It became wealth transferred immediately from the British public purse to the financial institution money owed of George Soros and other hedge fund managers. To place that in angle, 3 billion kilos in 1992 ought to have constructed dozens of hospitals or funded the whole British Navy for months. It turned into long gone in a single afternoon. The chaotic scenes within the trading flooring that day have become legendary. Traders described a feeling of unreality. The telephones had been ringing non-forestall with orders from customers shouting, "Sell, sell, promote." The displays that displayed the currency charges were flashing red, usually Forex actions via fractions of a penny. On Black Wednesday, the pound changed into dropping by using whole pence each couple of minutes. It turned into a loose fall. One trader at a first-rate British financial institution recalled shouting at his broker to sell 50 million kilos. The dealer shouted returned that there had been no consumers. Who could buy a folding knife? The only consumer changed into the Bank of England. The bank changed into acting because the purchaser of last no-tell status by myself towards a tsunami of promoting. The traders may want to see the financial institution S orders on their displays. Huge round numbers seeking to maintain the line at 2.77 marks. And they might see those orders being wolfed instantly via the marketplace. It turned into like looking a lion being eaten alive by using ants. The maximum dramatic moment took place inside the political bunker. Prime Minister John Major changed into physically and emotionally exhausted. He had spent the day combating a struggle he couldn't win. There are reports that at one point he retreated to his non-public room and sat in silence watching the wall. His chancellor, Norman Lamont, was defined as being in a nation of surprise. He had been compelled to elevate hobby fees to 15%, a pass he knew become political suicide, most effective to need to cancel it hours later. He had correctly marched the British troops up the hill and then marched them right back off once more whilst the enemy laughed. The give-up speech that Lamont gave out of doors the Treasury that evening became one of the most painful moments in British political history. As he stood there, flashes popping in his face, admitting that Britain turned into leaving the euro, a heckler from the group shouted a query that cut through the noise. He shouted about the wife and children at Domestic who had been scared of the hobby prices. Lamont seemed like a ghost. He knew that his reputation for financial competence changed into shredded. But even as London became reeling in New York, George Soros became tallying his winnings. The Quantum Fund had made earnings of about $1.1 billion. But Soros wasn't the handiest one. Other well-known buyers like Paul Tudor-Jones and Bruce Nur additionally made hundreds of tens of millions. He changed into the most important payday within the history of Wall Street. Soros became a superstar in a single day. The press dubbed him the man who broke the financial institution of England. He changed into vilified within the British tabloids. They painted him as a ruthless villain, an overseas predator who had robbed the British people. But Soros changed into unrepentant. He argued that he had executed nothing wrong. He turned into a market participant. He saw a rate that became incorrect, and he guessed towards it. He argued that the fault lay with the British government for trying to defy the legal guidelines of economics. He stated that if the politicians hadn't been so stubborn, they could have devalued the pound quicker and saved the taxpayers billions. In his view, he had simply completed an essential surgical treatment on a sick, affected person, even though the surgery changed into brutal. The aftermath of Black Wednesday rippled through British politics for decades. The Conservative Party, which had always prided itself on being the celebration of sound money and economic competence, in no way completely recovered. John Major's authority became destroyed. He limped on as top minister for some extra years, but he became a dead man taking walks. In 1997, the Labour Party, led through Tony Blair, won a landslide victory, finishing 18 years of Conservative rule. The memory of Black Wednesday was a key cause why the electorate turned their backs at the Tories. But there's a twist to this story, an abnormal irony that historians and economists now debate. In the days and weeks after Black Wednesday, the British financial system did now not crumble. In truth, it boomed. Once Britain was out of the ERM, it became free. It no longer had to keep interest quotes artificially excessive to thrill the Germans. The government straightaway reduced hobby fees. They fell from the insane 15% down to 6% in a remember of months. This became a large alleviation for owners and businesses. The decreased pound made British exports less expensive around the arena. British factories began selling more vehicles and machinery. The economic system began to develop at a fast tempo. This length had become known as the Golden Financial Legacy. Many economists now argue that Black Wednesday changed into definitely White Wednesday. They argue that being compelled out of the ERM was the excellent aspect that could have passed off to Britain. It stored the USA from a deepening recession. It proved that looking to chain your economic system to any other United States is a mistake. This realization had a profound effect on the destiny of Europe. In the overdue 1990s, whilst the European countries had been getting ready to release the euro, the single Forex, Britain stood aside. The trauma of Black Wednesday was still clean. The British public and the politicians checked out the euro and noticed another lure. They remembered what happened when they misplaced manipulative their very own hobby fees. Because of George Soros, Britain decided no longer to join the euro. While France, Germany, Italy, and Spain gave up their countrywide currencies to apply the euro, Britain stored the pound. This election has formed the history of the 21st century. If Britain had joined the euro, the Brexit vote in 2016 might never have came about. The UK could have been so deeply incorporated into the European economy that leaving might have been impossible. So in a typical manner, George Soros failed to just spoil a financial institution. He changed the destiny of a country. He kept the pound sterling alive through forcing it to crash. The legacy of that day additionally modified how imperative banks performed. Before 1992, relevant bankers believed they were masters of the universe. They notioned they could set the fee in their Forex, truly by means of issuing a decree. Black Wednesday taught them a lesson in humility. It taught them that during a globalized international, the economic markets have more money than any authority. If the market turns towards you, you cannot fight it. You have to float with it. Today, the Bank of England operates very otherwise. It specializes in concentrated on inflation, no longer alternate charges. It communicates without a doubt with the marketplace to keep away from surprises. The vanity of the antique days is long past, replaced via a cautious recognize for the power of the invisible hand. George Soros went directly to turn out to be a major philanthropist, spending billions of his to sell democracy and open societies around the world. But he remains a controversial figure. To a few, he's a terrific investor who exposed the incompetence of politicians. To others, he's a risky speculator who destabilized a country for income. But regardless of how you view him, the activities of September 16, 1992 stand as a turning factor in records. It turned into the day the monetary markets declared their independence from the kingdom. It became the day the electronic herd trampled the antique guard. As we look back on the footage of that chaotic day on the sweating politicians and the shouting traders, we are seeing the start of the modern-day global. A world wherein cash moves at the rate of light, where countrywide borders are porous, and where an unmarried man with a PC and a conviction can venture an empire and win. The Bank of England nonetheless stands on Threadneedle Street. Its walls are still thick. Its vaults are nevertheless deep. But the aura of invincibility is long gone. It changed into shattered on a Wednesday in September by way of a bet that modified the arena. And the ghost of that day nonetheless haunts the quarters of power, reminding every chancellor and each prime minister that the marketplace is constantly looking and the market is never incorrect for lengthy. The imperial pound died that day, no longer with a bang, but with a smartphone call from a dealer promoting 10 billion units of a dream that turned into now not real. And in its region rose a new fact, cold, tough, and dominated by using the numbers. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay beforehand of the curve, due to the fact when the records books are written, you may want to be among the few who saw it coming.